welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast series. I'm Nina Lockwood, founder and director of Intuitive Interim and Executive Search. Throughout this series, I will be sharing engaging conversations with talented leaders from across the UK transport sector. Today, I am delighted to welcome Mark Hopwood, Managing Director of Great Western Railway, back in situ after a 12-month tour of duty at South Western, to episode 10 of Intuitive Insights. Many people I speak to tell me that they fell into their career in the railway, and once they were in, they were captivated. Mark definitely didn't fall into it. His earliest memories of his love of rail is at 2 years of age. I loved my conversation with Mark, and if you have any interest at all in the railway, I am confident that you will enjoy it too. Good morning and welcome, Mark Hopwood, Managing Director of GWR. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Intuitive Insights podcast, coming live from your signal room, I see. So, pleasure to have you here. I've known you for a few years now, Mark, and I would have to say you are one of the most knowledgeable people in the industry in terms of what's going on. And I think that if we cut you in half, you'd have railway running right the way through you. There's a clear passion for what you do and all things transport, actually. I'm going to start off in that time-honoured way for this podcast and ask you to share your career story with us, please. I'm keen to know why the railway, how did you get into it, and how did you get to where you are today?
Well, thanks so much. It's a great honour, Nina, to be here. I think this is emerging as perhaps the closest thing to the Graham Norton show that we've got in the railway industry. So it's a real honour to be invited along. Well, the railway industry for me, it's not a big secret, but just in case anyone hasn't twigged, I've got quite a strong interest in the railway. So I've always had that interest, I guess, from the earliest recorded point, I think, was when I was about 2 and I lived to the south of Manchester, actually, Whaley Bridge. My grandparents took me down to the railway line and they tell the story, and it grew up from there, really. I used to visit my grandparents in South Wales, and my grandfather would not even allow me to step foot in the house until I'd recited every station from Cardiff Central to Ystrad in the correct order. I could probably still do it today, but I won't bore you with that. And my mother didn't drive. My father worked abroad quite a bit, so we used the trains, and it became an interest and a passion. I did flirt with the idea of the airline industry, but I did have an operation on both my eyes when I was very young to rectify a squint. And I remember my last appointment, I was told, "You're all sorted, Mark. You can do whatever you want, but you'll never be an airline pilot." And it's probably just as well, actually, for the safety of the flying public, that I've never been an airline pilot. So I was always interested in the railway, and that interest obviously grew and has so during my time at school, the biggest row I ever had with my parents was about whether I was going to leave school at 16 and go to work, or whether I was going to carry on and do A-levels and go to university. And that debate took a few twists and turns. But I was very lucky, actually. I went to the Royal Grammar School in High Wycombe. They were very supportive. And like most teenage boys, I got involved and ran the Model Railway Club at school and earned lots of profit. But I also got a letter from the British Railways Board. One of our governors was a key person in the BR board, and he set me up with a week's work shadowing when I was in the sixth form, because my father had put his foot down and said, "You're not going off to work at 16. So I was studying my A-levels, my economics and politics, geography and history, and I did a week at Reading with the area managers team. I shadowed a lady you may have met, Sarah Kendall, who's worked in a number of high-profile jobs. So Sarah was assistant area manager. She'd just come off the BR graduate training scheme, and she'd obviously upset someone because they pinned me along with her for a week, and we did a number of things. And I went up to the signal box in Reading to see the Royal Train come through with the area operations manager, and I'll tell you a quick story, because one of the signallers up there was a guy called Dave Davison. And when I was MD of Great Western, to start with, Dave was one of my duty control managers. So he always used to tell this story about this sort of snotty 16-year-old kid turning up in the signal box. And I actually arranged a week's work experience for my daughter not so recently, just before Dave retired. And Joanna wants to work in finance, and she went up to the finance team, and they took her into the control, and Dave was sat in the chair, and he said to her, "So have you got any questions then?" And she was asking about some of the disruption, and she said, "How much will this cost in Schedule 8 then?" And she said, "Well, we know whose daughter you are then." So but Dave did say to me that it was a sign that he was due to retire, the fact that I'd rocked up with my daughter for work experience. So that led to a job offer. And initially it was just a job for the summer, Nina. So I just went there to earn a bit of money. I had a place at the London School of Economics, and I was going to head off to university, but I actually messed up one of my A-levels. I'd probably spent a bit too much time chasing trains and not enough time studying. So I did very well in my politics, not so well in my geography. So I decided to stay on for a year, reapply. And I got a place at Essex University, but I also got promoted from my first job in the railway, which was the Telephone Inquiry Bureau in Reading, and that's where it all started on the 26th of June. And I've still got actually my 1989 timetable and my 1989 fares manual, because that's what we used in those days to answer questions about how much it cost and what time the trains went. And I've always had an emotional attachment to that part of the job. I actually went out to India a few years ago to visit the National Rail Inquiries Office, and they were very perplexed when this top managing director sat down in one of the chairs and started answering the calls and giving people information. And I did that for a few calls, and I managed okay. And the next call came through in Mumbai, and it was a help point call from a little station in the Cotswolds at Finstock. And it was my very strict station manager, Irish lady who's now retired, called Teresa Cisse, and she was testing the help points. And I said, "Hello, Great Western Railway help point, how can I help you?" And she said, "It's Teresa Cisse, the station manager. I'm testing the help point." And I said, "It's great to hear from you, Teresa. It's Mark Hopwood here in Mumbai." And she said, "Don't you get funny with me, young man," she said. So that was revisiting the job a few years later, doing the job in perhaps a different way. So I was promoted into the ticket office, and then promoted again into the traffic and customer services office. And then, having got my place at Essex University to study politics, I wrote out my resignation letter, and I went up to see the area manager and said, "Well, I really am leaving. I'm off to university." So he said, "Go away and take your silly little letter away and come back and see me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So I went and saw him at 9 o'clock, and he had another letter for me, which was headed up university, retention of conditions. And it's probably one of the most valuable letters I've ever had, because British Rail agreed to send me off to university. I could keep all my travel, which, as a young rail enthusiast, to keep all my travel facilities was quite important. But more importantly for me now, with my 50th birthday looming, they said that I could stay in the pension fund, and they would backdate my pension contributions to the day I started from my period at university, and they would guarantee me a job in all the holidays 2 grades higher than all the other students, which of course made me even more unpopular than usual. So that offer was snapped straight out of his hand. So I headed off to university, came back in the holidays. But by that point, I'd already got my experience of a whole number of things: telephone inquiries, selling tickets, managing some of the basic operational stuff in the office, answering customer complaints and letters. And I landed in university, which was quite a different experience for me, having had a strong interest in railways and actually done some work. A lot of students, of course, were there straight from school, and I'd had a year's work experience. And I began to broaden my interests a little bit at university. So I got involved in some of the politics at university, and I also got involved in the radio station and was involved in running that. And I DJ'd on a number of shows. So that was quite good fun.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So when I graduated from university, they took me back, and I did a couple of weeks doing customer correspondence, but I was then asked to move in to manage on a shift basis the control centre. We just split. I know a few of the people who've come on your podcast have talked about the British Rail split for OFQ, which was organising for quality, and that's when we really moved away from the regions towards Network Southeast and intercity and regional railways. So the Network Southeast operation out of Paddington had a control office in Reading, and the old control was in Swindon, and none of the old timers really wanted to move, so they had a lot of gaps in the control office. So I was asked to run the control office on shift, which was a bit of a risk for someone who'd been sat at their desk doing university exams 4 weeks ago, but it sort of worked out okay. I did have one unit that ran out of fuel, and I had to find a locomotive to drag it back, but managed to blame someone else for that. So apart from that, it went okay. And but I'd obviously had some guidance from managers, senior managers around me about what I should be doing, and they had said, for example, that there really wasn't any point for me going on the management training scheme, because they felt that all the jobs they'd given me in my 3 years of holidays at university had given me a lot of that knowledge and experience already. So, but they did feel that while I looked like a sort of a pig in the proverbial in my control office job, they wanted me to get a bit more experience managing people. So I was encouraged, and British Rail had this, I think Diane Crowther was talking a little bit about this, but in those days, people used to make suggestions, but they were slightly more than suggestions, Nina, that you were well advised to follow their advice. So I moved to Slough Station as a duty manager just before we chopped the railway up into rail track. So I had shift responsibility for pretty much everything that went on the station, the ticket office, but also we had responsibility for some aspects, what we called safety of the line. So attending things like fatalities and going out to operational incidents, acting as a pilotman, which is an operational term when the signalling fails, where you're effectively a human token, but also trained as an emergency guard. And there was one Saturday evening, actually, where the signalling failed and the guard went sick. So I worked the service and did both jobs as the pilotman and the guard. I did get a please explain on the Monday morning saying the rule book doesn't allow for you to do both jobs. I said, well, show me which page in the rule book it says that. I said I thought it was an efficient solution to the problem. So we had one or two interesting little moments. So I did that for, I don't know, about 9 months. And one of the fascinating things at Slough, of course, we were just down the road from Windsor, and we used the Royal Train a little bit more in those days. So we used to have really regular Royal Train movements, and that was a great opportunity for me to meet a number of the royal family. And British Rail was really good. I think in this day and age, a lot of people are very status conscious, and they'd all sort of barge in. But in those days, the senior managers all used to just leave us to it. So initially, my boss and then me, we used to just deal with it ourselves. They were private visits, but I had the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Charles, Princess Anne, a number of, we had William and Harry through William and Harry's nanny, Tiggy Leg Bork, who'd had a little bit too much to drink one evening, and we had to look after her. So it was quite an interesting experience there at Slough. And I applied for the station manager's job after I'd been there for about 9 months, and I got that job, which obviously I was pleased about, and I did that for about 2.5 years, and that took us right up to the privatisation process. And Thames Trains was awarded to a management employee buyout with support from the Go Ahead Group. So the management team were involved in that, and I was involved in that a little bit. So when we moved into the private sector, I was asked to go up to head office to help with setting up some of the initiatives that we'd signed up to on the commercial side. And then I was given responsibility for station access, track access. We had quite a complicated arrangement at Paddington, where Great Western, which was at the time the intercity operator, used to provide us with services. So I got rid of all that and we set up our own team. But it was also at the point that Heathrow Express was starting. So we had to support Heathrow Express. And I remember watching and listening to your podcast with Chris Birchall, and Chris talking about the startup of Heathrow. And that's where I first met Chris, actually, when he was working on that, and he had just come off the graduate training scheme. And then that job evolved into a more operational job. Sadly, Go Ahead bought all the business, but decided to get rid of a lot of the team. So there were 9 people in the commercial team. And by the time that reorganisation had finished, I was the only one left, and they asked me to move across to the operations side. I found that quite difficult, actually, because in British Rail, things like that hadn't really happened in that way. And that was quite a tough experience. And sometimes you read about these things, and they often say the people who sort of survive these experiences in the business find it more difficult than the people who've taken the money and left, which I think I can relate to. So, a guy called Nick Ilsley, who'd given me that station manager's job and been a great source of advice and was actually great fun to work with as well. Nick left, and I'd moved across to manage the control and the performance team, which obviously I had some experience of previously, but that was another big opportunity for me in a relatively small train company at the time. I mean, we've now subsumed Thames Trains into Great Western, and it's sort of distant history for some people, but at the time it was a separate business based in Reading. And then something really, really difficult and really horrible happened, which was the Ladbroke Grove train accident. So my boss, as operations manager, was on holiday. He was in Spain, and 8:05 one morning. And again, Chris Birchall spoke about this when he spoke to you, but we had this horrific accident outside Paddington with a Thames Trains and a Great Western train. It was awful. 31 people lost their lives, but there was a period during the immediate aftermath where nobody could access those carriages. Nobody knew what was going on, and the press got a little bit carried away and started talking about over 100 people potentially dead. So the whole thing was a pretty tough experience for everybody in our business, in Great Western, and in what was then Railtrack. And of course, Great Western had earlier experience of the Southall accident, where one of the trains had hit a freight train. I'd actually been on a train out of Paddington past the Southall site about 5 minutes before that accident happened, and got off the train at Reading to find out. And the Ladbroke Grove incident was a train that I regularly caught up to our offices in Paddington. So that was, I felt quite close to those incidents. But I had to sit in a room in Reading with driver managers, and we had to deal with some pretty tough questions, like who of us is going to go and see the driver's wife and tell her what's happened and deal with that. Very, very difficult experience. But looking back on it now, clearly I learned a lot from that. But in many ways, I'd rather not have learned from that. And of course, the railway is very much a safer place, and Southall and Ladbroke Grove very much triggered a lot of the investment in things like train protection, warning systems. But I was given a lot of responsibility at the time. Terry Worrell, who was a fantastic guy, was the director and general manager. Terry had a wealth of experience. Terry was very much focused on responding to that incident and said to me, "Look, Mark, you just need to concentrate on running the rest of the the rest of the Thames Trains business. And I remember having to stand up and talk to the management team that afternoon while most of the other members of the top team were at site. And that's what you're paid to do. But when I was 27 years old at the time, and it's quite a challenge. So I enjoyed my time at Thames, but I decided that I'd grown up in this business and I knew it well, but I needed to do something different, really. And perhaps Ladbroke Grove was a signal to me to do something different. And I think, as fond as I was of the operational railway, I think Ladbroke Grove did take the shine off that a little bit for me. So I applied for a job in Railtrack and headed up to Railtrack head office at the very start of 2000, and joined a team that was working on refranchising. Of course, we had a Labour government by then. We had John Prescott and we had Sir Alistair Morton, and there were all sorts of exciting things being talked about in terms of reopening routes on the Transpennine, changing the franchise map, building tunnels under London, and all sorts of stuff. So I went to work on some of those projects. That's actually where I met Diane Crowther for the first time, actually, because Diane was working on the Chiltern Evergreen project, and I had some involvement with that with her. I remember Diane and I ended up in a room in Marylebone with Adrian Shooter's corporate bankers, and we didn't have our corporate bankers with us, so we had to wing it and then go back and make sure we took the corporate bankers next time. So that was quite an interesting experience. And Railtrack was in some ways a new organisation, but in some ways a very traditional organisation. I remember occasionally getting called up to the 13th floor to brief the directors, and there are all these people scurrying around in waistcoats and black ties, serving them lunch. And in Thames Trains, we used to have to buy our own lunch, and even the managing director at Thames Trains went to the sandwich shop and bought his own lunch. So this was a very strange phenomena for me to encounter, but a fantastic learning opportunity. I think I probably got more out of it than Railtrack did, if I'm honest. But it was a great experience. I didn't stay there long because one of the team who'd been involved in Thames Trains and running it was a guy called David Franks, and many people will know David. And David had got the managing director's job up in Manchester for First North Western, and that business had been bought by Great Western Holdings and then passed to First Group Control. But it had got into some really serious difficulty, and David had to make some pretty tough decisions about how to run that business. But he didn't have an ops director, and he asked me. He actually misled me slightly. He came to see me in London to talk about refranchising for Wales and Borders, but he admitted after about 15 minutes he wasn't really interested in that, and that he'd come to talk to me about a job which then went through a headhunter, and I got the job. So that was one of my big breaks. So I was 29 years old, and I suddenly found myself moving to Manchester to manage 2,500 staff, 307 stations as ops director. Although we called it ops director, it was really the delivery as well. So I met some fantastic people up there, people like Catherine O'Brien, who worked for me. I actually put Catherine into her job permanently as the general manager, a number of other great people. And we worked really hard up there to sort out a lot of the issues around performance. And it was a big patch. Obviously Manchester and Liverpool, Preston were the sort of heart of it, but we ran as far south as Birmingham, up to Carlisle, Wakefield in Yorkshire, and across North Wales to Holyhead. So I spent 3 fantastic years there, really enjoyed it, and learnt a lot, and hopefully improved 1 or 2 things along the way. And then something we can't do at the moment, I went to a conference in London, and I ended up sat next to Dominic Booth, who Dominic I think he was on Diane's year on the PR graduate scheme, but he asked me if I'd come up to London and be operations director for the National Express businesses. So they put their London commuter talks together, C2C, Silverlink and Wagon, and he wanted me to be ops director and manage the general managers. So that was a move back to London, International Express, running I don't know, probably 25-30% of the London commuter business. Another good move. I enjoyed that. And I did that for a couple of years. The franchise changed shape a little bit, and I was going to leave, actually. Andrew Haynes had asked me to join the new First Capital Connect franchise, which took part of our business. And National Express asked me to stay and said they'd give me the managing director's job. So I ended up as managing director for C2C for Silverlink, and then we added the Gatwick Express business onto that as well. But sadly, National Express lost a number of their franchises through remapping, and Andrew Haynes decided to have another go at recruiting me and was successful. So he asked me to join him at Great Western. So we were at the very start of 2008 by now, and Andrew was dealing with a very difficult situation at Great Western. He was running the rail division for First and trying to run Great Western, and he asked me to go and support him. And then Andrew left First Group later that year and actually went to the Civil Aviation Authority. And I was asked to step up and take on the managing director's role. So it was a big business. It had merged my old business I grew up in, Thames Trains, with the intercity business and the regional railways business in Bristol and the West Country. And but again, it was a business with a lot of problems. It had signed a franchise agreement that contained a number of things that, quite frankly, were not deliverable or were exceptionally unpopular. And performance was rock bottom. The relationship with Network Rail, as it then was very poor. And I remember them publishing the list of the most overcrowded trains in the country. And it came out, and all 10 of them were Great Western trains. And our performance was really, really bad. The stakeholders were very unhappy. Members of Parliament were screaming for the franchise to be removed. So after working with Andrew, I became MD, and then I've been there ever since. But obviously, we've done quite a bit. 2 years after I joined, we were actually awarded Train Operator of the Year at the Rail Business Awards, which I was really proud of to move the business forward. And obviously, Great Western has been recognised since, and it's a very different business today, Nina. I mean, the railway's been electrified. The customer base is quite different in a way. There's been a real transformation both within the business and externally. And I also mentioned Heathrow Express earlier, and Heathrow Express was set up as a separate organisation entirely, but we've actually done a deal with the airport, and we now operate Heathrow Express for them. All of those different sort of entities that used to run trains into Paddington are now in one organisation, and I manage it, which I wouldn't have imagined when I was the 16-year-old that wandered into the signal box in Reading in 1988. And of course, Great Western, I have been there a while, so I think I'm the longest serving MD, but Steve Montgomery, who's my boss, did break it up for me last year, so he sent me off for a year's sabbatical at South Western Railway. So I've got that on the CV as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure anyone would have considered it to be a sabbatical, Mark, so I love your positive take on that. I remember us having a chat at the Railway Ball, actually, so it will have been November 2019, and you telling me that you were off to South Western in the January, but you were only going for 3 months and then you'd be back. Yeah. Clearly, Steve had other ideas.
Yeah, that's right. Now, of course, then coronavirus came along as well, which did change the timings on things. But I enjoyed it actually over there. It's very difficult because a lot of people at Southwest were keen for me to stay, which was nice. So I felt bad, if I'm honest, not staying. But equally, I'd given commitments to people at Great Western that I would come back. So it's a bit like my 2 girls, and making sure I never ever say to any of them that one's a favourite. So.
Absolutely, you can't do that. Mark, that I have thoroughly enjoyed hearing that career story, and I think that although you've described yourself a couple of times in there as a rail enthusiast, what comes through to me so much as you've gone through is this absolute passion for the system, for how it works, for how it all pulls together, and what it actually delivers. And I know that from talking to people who know you and who have worked with you, that the people aspect of all of this is really important to you. And I know there's some great stuff happening at Great Western at the moment, and has been for the last couple of years, around the employee engagement piece and the knock-on effect that that's had on the customer satisfaction numbers. So perhaps as we move forward, you might kind of give us a little bit more in terms of the Your Voice survey, because I think it certainly would fall into my category of best practice, what's happening in your business in that respect. But maybe that comes out in the next bit, where I'm going to ask you in terms of the current state of play of the industry. Clearly, it has been an exceptionally challenging period of time since the 23rd of March 2020. Not one that I think any of us would want to go through again. But the flip side of that is that wherever there is a crisis, there is opportunity. And I think that we share this view that there are definitely opportunities ahead to do things differently and perhaps reimagine the railway. What would be on your wish list, Mark, in terms of the changes that need to be made and the ways that we might want to do things differently, or the opportunities that are ahead? What would be the top 3 things on your wish list?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think, in terms of what we've got to achieve, I think we've got to recover from where we are. I think we've got to think about the future. One of the things that I think is going to become a bigger issue once people have some confidence that the pandemic is behind us, I think, is the environment and decarbonisation. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure on us to deliver in that area. And I think, we talked a little bit about my interest in trains, and I suppose my interest in trains has developed from the trains themselves to the way the trains actually impact people. And I think that's probably the most fascinating thing. And for anybody that has studied the history of the world, really, but in particular the UK, the railways have played a massive role. And there's a whole number of sort of towns and cities across the UK that wouldn't even exist in the shape they do today if it wasn't for the railway. And even the fact that we all look at the clock and, you're in Lancashire and I'm in Oxfordshire, but it's the same time wherever we are, and that's down to the railway. We didn't have that before. So I think we will need to rebuild the country in the widest sense as we come out of this pandemic, and rail has an opportunity to play, I think, a really leading role in that. But I think the three wishes that I have. I mean, first of all, around the pandemic itself. So we need to eradicate the pandemic, and I think one of the things that's been really difficult, I think, for people in rail is, and a lot of people I don't think have come to terms with it, is that the railway's used to dealing with crises of its own making. I mean, I talked about Southall and Ladbroke Grove, which were really tragic, but ultimately they were caused by things in the industry, if we're honest. And the railway industry has had other challenges like that. But, we didn't cause this pandemic. And as clever as we might think we are, we're not going to fix it either. And we are in the hands of other people. And actually, I think it's very tempting in the middle of a crisis like this to sometimes exaggerate the impact in the long run. I mean, I was looking the other day after the 9/11 events, the awful plane crashes into the Twin Towers in New York. People did surveys and said, 40% of people have said they'll never fly in a plane in America ever again. Well, that's clearly not true, and that's not happened. So I think we can bounce back from this. I think so that's my first wish is to get rid of the pandemic, which everyone would share, but I think it's just important that it's there. I think the second thing I'm sort of talking about is enlightenment, and I think there's some of us in the railway industry who perhaps are a little bit stuck in our ways, protect our own interests, whether it's people in certain parts of government, people in certain parts of the private sector, whether it's people in Network Rail or trade unions or even sort of individual user groups on certain lines. People tend to think about the things that are immediately important and historically have always been the case for them. And actually, I think we need to think about things a little bit differently in the future and how we can do some of the things people expect from us, like look after customers better, run the railway cheaper and more effectively, grasp new technology and get on with it. The railway does suffer, I think, quite a lot from not invented here syndrome, which is, good ideas are not always welcome if they haven't been dreamt up by that particular business or that person. So I think we could all be a little bit more enlightened in the future. And then my final wish, I think, really is around that decarbonisation agenda. As fond as I am of smoky, smelly, noisy diesel trains in some ways, I do know that they're not great for the environment. And I have to say, I'm sick and tired of people talking about decarbonisation and not actually moving this forward, because there are some great opportunities for us quite quickly to get on and deliver this. And I think the railway industry would look a lot better to our customers, to our stakeholders, and to the country as a whole if actually, we've got some reasonable environmental credentials, but I think we could do a lot better. And people in other industries like cars and aviation are moving ahead faster than us. So the pandemic disappearing, an enlightenment amongst all of us, and being able to deliver some decarbonisation. Those are three things. Lots of other things are important, and some of your speakers have spoken about them, but those are three things that I would pull out, I think.
Yeah, and as you said, I don't think anybody would disagree with you on any of those three, Mark. And I think your comment about decarbonisation brings me to one of my soapbox topics, if you like, which is, as an industry, we're very good at talking to each other about how good we are and what an exciting industry and the stuff that's happening. But I think for me, decarbonisation almost falls into the same category as careers in the rail industry does, because we're not very good at telling people outside of the sector that what a difference we can make in terms of that clean air, in terms of the environment. And whilst for some people it might be obvious, I think we've also got that image of trains, creating a bit of muck and steam and smoke. So I think that message about how much cleaner it could be is a really important one. Absolutely. So before we move on to talking about a little bit more about your views in terms of what you've learnt from the last 10 months for you personally, what are you doing differently? I wonder if you would just give us a couple of minutes, Mark, in terms of the employee engagement work that's being done at GWR, because I spoke to your HR director, Ruth, a couple of weeks ago, and she was telling me about some really quite stunning results that you're having and the knock-on effect of having a happier team and therefore the customers feeling the benefit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, look, I think the whole sort of thing from Mark Hopwood getting really into employee engagement, I guess, started. I'd always been conscious of those issues, but when I became the managing director of C2C, having previously been the ops director, the first report I think pretty much that landed on my desk was the employee engagement scores for C2C. And C2C had brand new trains, it had a lot of investment, it was delivering much better punctuality, and I thought it ought to be in good shape. But it had the worst customer engagement scores in the whole of National Express, and I thought, this is terrible, really. And I just cleared my diary and went out onto the route and just spent a lot of time talking to the colleagues, to the drivers, to the station staff, people on the trains, people in the depots, not just in the daytime, but I surprised them and appeared at stations at 6 a.m. and Shoebury Depot at 10 o'clock at night. And I learned an enormous amount about what was driving their views and their opinions, what they thought of certain people in my organisation and in the business, and what they thought about things like communication. And I worked with some great consultants in a company called MSB, Don Porter and Brian Hamill, who had actually come out of British Airways and had worked in British Airways through the 1980s and addressed some similar challenges. And they gave me a great deal of support. So we put in place a plan, and a year later, we had the biggest improvement in employee satisfaction at CTC. So I've always taken that thing quite seriously, and we've obviously had some challenges at Great Western because we had to close some of our maintenance depots. We've been through quite a difficult rebuilding of the route we've changed people's jobs from being a guard on a high-speed train shutting doors themselves to working on a more modern train. So that change has been difficult for people. But yeah, I've been determined that we will have, over the long term, a plan to address engagement. And we've still got a lot of work to do, Nina, and I don't regard this as finished business by any means, but we're currently seeing an engagement score of 87%. And actually Matthew, who ran the business while I was away, has done a fantastic job and has raised those scores even higher than they were. So we've actually managed to get people more engaged with us during the pandemic than they were before, and we're now delivering the sorts of results which are comparable with a lot of other sort of blue chip businesses outside rail, and we're significantly higher than the average scores in the transport sector. And there's a lot of research being done on this, isn't there, about how people who are engaged with their business will engage with the customer and deliver better results.
And 87%, that is quite incredible on an engagement survey, especially bearing in mind everything that's going on. So huge congratulations to you and your team for that. It's brilliant. So in terms of learning, Mark, there's lots of things changed in the last 10, 11 months. Obviously, the biggest one probably being the way that we're working and working from home, or living from work, living at work, as Sir Peter Henry refers to it. What have you learned? What do you think? What are the biggest things for you that you've changed personally that over the last 10, 11 months that have been a benefit?
Yeah, I think some of it is about how I use my time and what's important. I think some of the change I hopefully see as temporary and transitional. I've spent a lot of time working from home. I don't really intend to in the long run. That there have been, I think, as some of your other speakers have said, there have been some benefits to me personally from that. I've got 3 older children. I've got 2 younger girls, Coco and Heidi, here, and they've seen a lot more of their dad, and I've very much enjoyed that. But I've not been able to get out and about in the business as much as I would like, either when I was at Southwest or here. And I do go out and about, but you have to be careful, Nina, because you can't just go wandering around, into offices just for fun. There needs to be a reason for it. So that obviously does limit one's ability to do some stuff. So there've been some negative sides to it. I think the technology, we've all probably got to grips. We just started using Zoom before the virus struck in, but we weren't using it particularly well and effectively. This whole thing has forced us to do that. So I think there are some issues that we've definitely picked up along the way and learned from. But those are some of the changes for me in the business, I think.
Yeah. We have, as you say, it's been certainly the whole advent of the video call. We were using it. We've used Skype quite a bit for interviews because we've brought a number of people back from overseas, back to the UK Railway over the last couple of years, and my expenses budget didn't run to me taking a trip to Australia to do interviews. So we have started using it in that way, but it has been quite a revolution, hasn't it, in the last 10, 11 months?
Absolutely, yeah.
And certainly kind of gives you a different way of using your time. But I would have to say I am really, really looking forward to the day that I can get back down into St Pancras Station. I'm missing being there. I'm missing kind of being on the train and seeing people face to face in a kind of in the same physical location.
Absolutely.
So quite excited about that. So Mark, to bring this conversation to a close, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I could definitely chat to you for another couple of hours at least, because there's loads of things that I'd like to ask you about. But one of the time-honoured things for Intuitive Insights podcast is to ask my guests to leave us with a quote. So something which for you sticks in your mind, helps you, inspires you. What would be one of your favourite quotes that you can leave us with, Mark?
Well, I'm going to be disobedient, Nina, I think, and just drop three in very quickly. But Gerard Fines said, when you reorganise, you bleed. And he was a railway manager who wrote a book. He actually got sacked for writing a book. When I studied politics, I studied a guy who ran Florence in the worked for the ruler of Florence in the 16th century. He's a quite unpleasant character called Machiavelli, but he did have one or two words of wisdom. And he said, he who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command, which I think is worth thinking about. Obviously, it's written in a slightly sexist way, but the message hopefully sounds. And we were talking about Great Western and the work on employee engagement. And Tom Peters is one of the great management gurus. And he said the magic formula that successful businesses have discovered is to treat customers like guests and employees like people, which I think is...
I love that. I love that one, Mark. I haven't heard that one for a while. That takes me back to... my first career, which was in banking, and my responsibility ultimately was for service. And Tom Peters was one of my gurus, and that was one of my favourite quotes. So thank you for reminding me of that. It's perfect. Mark, I knew I would enjoy this conversation. My cheeks are aching from smiling because I've enjoyed it so much. A huge thank you to you for taking the time to join us and to share your story. I know it will interest and enthuse and inspire people. So thank you from me to you for doing that, and enjoy the rest of your day.
No, thanks so much, Nina. It's been a great experience, and all the best, and well done for setting these podcasts up. I think they're great, so thank you.
Thank you so much to Mark Hopwood for sharing his thoughts and insights. The next episode of Intuitive Insights will be with you on the 18th of March, when I will be joined by Julian Edwards, Managing Director of West Midlands Trains.